I didn't plan to block him that morning. I woke up fully intending to ignore the notification and go on with my day. But the message was already there when I unlocked my phone. Just his name. No preview. No context. After weeks of silence, it felt deliberate, like he knew exactly when to resurface. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. We'd been broken up for a little over 3 months. No dramatic explosion, no cheating reveal, no single moment everyone could point to and say, "That's when it ended." It was slower than that. A quiet erosion, conversations that went nowhere, promises that never became actions, me asking for clarity, him asking for patience, over and over until I realized I was the only one waiting. The breakup itself was calm, almost polite. He said he needed space. I said I understood. We hugged, said we'd stay civil, maybe even friends one day. The kind of ending people praise because it looks mature from the outside. But what followed didn't feel mature at all. He kept appearing. Not fully, not honestly, just enough to keep a door cracked open. A meme sent late at night. A "hope you're doing well" text with no follow-up. A reaction to my story, then silence again. Each time, it pulled me right back into a headspace I was trying desperately to leave. I told myself he didn't mean harm, that he was just checking in, that I was overreacting by feeling unsettled every time his name lit up my screen. But my body told a different story. Every message made my chest tighten. Every reminder of him ruined the progress I'd made. I'd replay old conversations, wonder if he was regretting things. Imagine explanations had never actually offered, and then, just as suddenly, had disappeared again. No closure, no honesty, just presence without responsibility. I tried setting soft boundaries first. Short replies, neutral tone, no questions. I hoped he'd take the hint. He didn't. Then came today's message. The one with no preview. The one that made my hands shake slightly as I stared at the screen. I didn't open it. Instead, I realized something uncomfortable. I didn't owe him access to me just because we once loved each other. I didn't owe him explanations he'd never given me. And I didn't owe myself another emotional setback just to be nice. So I blocked him. No warning. No final message. No explanation. The silence afterward felt immediate and absolute. Like slamming a door I'd been holding open with shaking hands. And then the guilt hit. What if he needed something important? What if this was immature? What if blocking without explanation made me cruel? I imagined how it might look from his side, waking up and realizing I'd vanished. No context, no goodbye, just gone. Part of me wanted to unblock him and send a neat, thoughtful message explaining everything. How I needed space, how his half-presence was hurting me, how this wasn't punishment, just self-preservation. But another part of me knew something else. I'd already explained myself during the relationship. I'd explained my needs, my boundaries, my hurt, over and over. Had heard me. He just hadn't changed anything. Blocking him wasn't a conversation starter. It was an ending. And endings don't always come with explanations, especially when explaining has never made a difference. Still, the question lingers heavier than I expected. Was I wrong for blocking my ex without saying a word? Or was this the first time I chose peace over politeness, even if it made me look like the villain in his version of the story? The hours after I blocked him felt unreal, like I was waiting for something to happen that never did. No buzzing phone, no sudden regret-filled message slipping through, no dramatic fallout. Just quiet. At first, the quiet made me uneasy. I kept checking my phone out of habit, half expecting his name to reappear somehow, as if blocking him hadn't really counted. My brain was so used to being on alert that peace felt suspicious. I went through the day distracted, replaying every interaction we'd had since the breakup. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment when blocking him became necessary instead of dramatic. But there wasn't one single moment. It was the accumulation of all the small ones. The way he'd show up emotionally only when it suited him. The way he avoided real conversations but stayed just close enough to keep me from fully moving on. The way I'd told myself I was being understanding, when really I was just abandoning my own boundaries. By evening, the guilt settled in more deeply. I imagined him confused, scrolling through our old messages, wondering what had done wrong this time. I imagined mutual friends eventually mentioning that I'd blocked him, their tone carrying quiet judgment. Blocking without explanation is often seen as childish, cold, excessive. I always believed that too. I was the person who wanted closure, the person who valued communication, the one who thought disappearing was cruel. So why did this feel different? Because this wasn't avoidance. It was containment. I realized that every explanation I wanted to send him wasn't actually for him. It was for me. I wanted to feel reasonable, mature, fair. I wanted to protect my image as someone kind. Even at the cost of reopening wounds I'd worked hard to close. But explanations only matter when the other person is willing to listen, and had proven, repeatedly, that listening wasn't his strength. He preferred ambiguity. It allowed him to stay comfortable while I stayed confused. Blocking him wasn't about punishing him. It was about removing the possibility of being pulled back into a dynamic that had already ended. The next few days were harder than I expected. Without his messages popping up, my mind filled a silence on its own. I wondered if Head tried to reach out, if he was angry, hurt, relieved. I wondered if Head tell people I was dramatic or unstable. And then I stopped myself. None of that changed what blocking him gave me. Space that stayed intact. For the first time since the breakup, my thoughts were uninterrupted. I didn't analyze every notification. I didn't rehearse imaginary conversations. I slept better. I breathed easier. That's when it hit me. If blocking him was wrong, why did my body feel safer? A week later, a mutual friend casually mentioned him, said had been confused, that he didn't understand why I'd cut him off out of nowhere, that he thought things were fine between us. That part stung, because things were never fine. They were just unresolved in a way that benefited him. I almost defended myself, almost asked a friend to pass along an explanation, almost reopened the door I'd closed, but I didn't, because closure doesn't always come from mutual understanding. Sometimes it comes from decisive action. I didn't owe him access to my healing. I didn't owe him one more emotional labor session. I didn't owe him a final explanation just so he could feel better about how things ended. I owed myself consistency. Blocking him wasn't kind in the traditional sense. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't communicative. But it was honest in a way nothing else had been. It said, I'm done negotiating my peace. I still don't know how he tells the story now. Maybe I'm the villain. Maybe I'm the one who disappeared. Maybe he genuinely believes he did nothing wrong. But I know this. Staying reachable was costing me more than blocking ever did. So when I ask myself whether I was the asshole for blocking my ex without explanation, I don't ask it from a place of guilt anymore. I ask it from clarity. If protecting your mental health makes you look cold to someone who benefited from your openness, then maybe that's a consequence worth accepting. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself looks cruel to someone who no longer gets access to you. After that realization, something subtle but important began to change in me. I stopped narrating my life as if he were still an invisible audience. I didn't catch myself wondering how he'd react to a photo I posted or a decision I made. I stopped framing my progress as something he might notice one day. The absence of that mental habit felt like relearning how to stand without leaning on a wall. That was no longer there. That didn't mean I stopped thinking about him entirely. Memories surfaced in unexpected ways. A song in a grocery store, a place we used to go on weekends, a joke that only made sense to someone who knew him. Grief isn't linear, and neither is detachment, but the memories felt different now. They passed through instead of settling. I realized how much energy I'd spent managing his access to me after the breakup, deciding when to respond, how warm to sound, how distant was acceptable without being rude. I'd treated communication like a delicate negotiation, afraid that being too firm would make me seem heartless. Blocking him ended that negotiation entirely. There was no more performance of emotional availability, no more monitoring tone, no more second-guessing whether silence would be interpreted as anger or indifference. The boundary was clear, and because it was clear, it was peaceful. A few weeks later, I reread old messages not because I missed him, but because I wanted to understand myself. I noticed patterns I hadn't fully seen before. How often I explained my feelings. How often I asked for reassurance. How often he responded vaguely, postponing real engagement while keeping me emotionally tethered. It wasn't cruelty. It was avoidance. And I had enabled it by staying reachable. That realization was uncomfortable, but it was also empowering. It meant the ending wasn't just something that happened to me. It was something I participated in shaping. People talk a lot about closure as a conversation, conversation. A final exchange where everything is understood, forgiven, and neatly resolved. But some relationships never offer that. Some people don't give closure, they withhold it. Blocking him was the first time I stopped asking for something he couldn't give. I started to understand that explanations aren't always bridges. Sometimes they're invitations for debate, reinterpretation, or dismissal. Sometimes they're just another way of staying connected to someone who no longer deserves that access. I didn't block him because I hated him. I blocked him because neutrality had become impossible. Every interaction, no matter how small, reopened a dynamic that no longer served me. And slowly, the guilt began to lose its grip. I noticed how often guilt had guided my decisions in that relationship. How often I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. How often I'd accepted confusion to avoid confrontation. Blocking him felt like the first decision I made without consulting that guilt. That didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. I don't know if he ever understood why I disappeared. I don't know if he reflected or blamed me or moved on without a second thought. I don't control his version of the story. What I do control is the fact that I no longer wake up bracing myself for emotional whiplash. I no longer feel like my healing is conditional on someone else's behavior. I no longer mistake accessibility for kindness. Blocking him wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. And for the first time since the breakup, decisiveness felt like relief rather than loss. I wasn't erasing the past. I was protecting the present. And that distinction mattered more than any explanation ever could. As more time passed, I began to notice how my sense of self slowly returned to places it had quietly abandoned. I made plans without checking my phone afterward. I laughed without the familiar undercurrent of sadness that used to follow. I started filling my evenings with things that had nothing to do with recovery or distraction, but simple interest. It struck me how much emotional energy I'd spent staying available to someone who no longer belonged in my life. Availability had felt like maturity. Patience had felt like strength. But in reality, I had been keeping myself emotionally paused, waiting for a version of him that only existed in my hope. Blocking him forced movement. There were still moments of doubt. Late at night, when everything is louder, I wondered if I should have handled it better. I imagined alternative versions of myself, calmer, more articulate, sending a final message that explained everything perfectly. In those imagined endings, he finally understood. He apologized. He respected my boundary. But that version required him to suddenly become someone he had never been when it mattered. And I had to accept that no amount of careful wording could turn avoidance into accountability. I also had to confront something uncomfortable about myself. I had been equating kindness with self-erasure. I believed that being good meant being endlessly patient, endlessly reachable, endlessly understanding even when it hurt. Blocking him felt harsh because it broke that pattern. It was the first time I chose finality over hope. Friends noticed the change before I fully did. They said I seemed lighter, more present, less caught in my own head. One of them asked what finally helped me move on. I didn't know how to explain that it wasn't moving on. That helped it was stopping the slow reopening of the wound. Healing hadn't started when we broke up. It started when I removed his ability to keep reopening the door. That realization shifted how I thought about boundaries entirely. Boundaries weren't punishments. They weren't dramatic gestures. They were structures, quiet, firm decisions about what I would and wouldn't allow access to. Blocking him wasn't impulsive. It was overdue. I began to reflect on how often society frames blocking as immature or cruel, especially when it's done without explanation. But that judgment usually comes from people who have never had their clarity delayed by someone else's half-presence, from people who have never had their healing interrupted repeatedly by someone who didn't want them, but didn't want to lose them either. I stopped asking whether he deserved an explanation. The more important question became whether I deserved peace. I realized something else too. Explanations can sometimes serve the other person more than they serve you. They give them a sense of resolution, a narrative they can live with. But closure doesn't have to be mutual to be valid. I didn't disappear to punish him. I disappeared because staying visible was hurting me, and that distinction mattered, even if no one else ever understood it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't hoping for a message that would never come. I had stepped out of the space where uncertainty lived. Blocking him didn't erase the love we we once had. It didn't rewrite the good memories. It simply acknowledged that whatever we were holding onto after the breakup wasn't love anymore. It was habit, fear, and unfinished conversations that led nowhere. For the first time, I felt aligned with myself. And even though part of me still flinched at the thought of being seen as cold or unfair, that fear no longer outweighed the calm I'd found. I didn't need his understanding to justify my boundary. I only needed to respect it myself. There was a moment, months later, when I realized I hadn't thought about him all day. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't mark it on a calendar or tell anyone. I just noticed it in passing. The same way you notice a headache is gone only after hours of not feeling it. That absence felt earned. Before blocking him, my mind had been a revolving door. Even when I wasn't actively thinking about him, some part of me was always on standby, ready, alert, waiting. Blocking him shut that door completely, and over time, the quiet behind it became normal. That didn't mean I suddenly believed I'd handled everything perfectly. I still questioned myself when I heard stories about people who valued communication above all else. I still flinched when someone said blocking was immature or cruel or cowardly. Those words stuck because once upon a time I would have agreed with them. But then I'd remember what communication with him had actually looked like. Me explaining, him acknowledging but not changing, me waiting, him drifting, me hoping, him resurfacing just enough to reset the cycle. That wasn't communication. It was maintenance of access. I started seeing how often people confuse availability with emotional responsibility. How being reachable becomes a substitute for being accountable. He had never asked how his messages affected me, had never checked whether staying in touch helped or hurt, had simply assumed I would remain open because I always had. Blocking him disrupted that assumption. I thought about how many chances I'd already given him to understand me while we were together. How many times I'd explained my need for clarity, consistency, presence. None of those explanations had changed the outcome. They'd only delayed it. So why was I suddenly obligated to explain myself now when the relationship was already over? That question shifted something fundamental in me. I began to understand that explanations aren't always acts of kindness. Sometimes they're invitations for someone to argue with your boundary, to negotiate it, to soften it until it no longer protects you. Blocking him was the first boundary I set that couldn't be negotiated. I also realized how deeply I'd internalized the idea that being good meant being endlessly accessible, especially as someone who values empathy, especially as someone who hates hurting people. I had been trained in subtle ways to believe that my discomfort was a fair price for someone else's ease. Blocking him rejected that trait entirely. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a message. It wasn't meant to teach him anything. It was simply the moment I stopped making my healing conditional on his behavior. Occasionally, someone would still bring him up. A mutual friend, a passing comment, and every time I waited for the old reaction. The tightening in my chest, the urge to explain, the sudden flood of emotion. It didn't come. What came instead was neutrality. Not bitterness, not sadness, just distance. And I understood then that blocking him hadn't frozen me in anger. It had allowed me to move past it. I don't know if he ever reflected on why I disappeared. I don't know if he assumed I was dramatic or hurt or overreacting. I don't know if he noticed at all. But I do know this. The day I blocked him was the day I stopped asking for permission to move on. And if that makes me the asshole in his story, then that's a role I can live with. Because in my own, it was the moment I finally chose myself without apology. What surprised me most wasn't how much better I felt without him, it was how clearly I could see the relationship once I was no longer inside it. Distance sharpened everything. I began to recognize how often I'd mistaken uncertainty for depth, how I'd confused emotional intensity with connection, how I'd interpreted inconsistency as complexity instead of what it really was. Avoidance dressed up as mystery. Blocking him didn't just remove his messages. It removed the constant need to interpret him. I no longer asked myself what he meant. I no longer searched for subtext. I no longer waited for clarity that never arrived. That mental freedom was addictive. I started applying the same lens to other areas of my life. I noticed how often I tolerated ambiguity because it felt familiar. Heidi learned to sit with discomfort instead of naming it, just to keep relationships intact. Blocking him was the first time I chose decisiveness over endurance, and that choice rippled outward. I became more direct with people. I stopped responding out of obligation. I trusted my discomfort instead of dismissing it as oversensitivity. I realized that boundaries don't require consensus, they require conviction. There was still grief, but it had changed shape. It wasn't about losing him anymore. It was about mourning the version of myself who believed love meant staying open no matter the cost. I forgave that version of me slowly. She had done what she knew how to do. She had loved deeply. She had hoped honestly. She had stayed longer than she should have because she believed patience was a virtue. Blocking him wasn't a rejection of her. It was an evolution. One evening, I found the message had sent that morning, the one I never opened. I didn't unblock him. I didn't feel tempted to, but I acknowledged it in my mind for the first time. Whatever he wrote didn't matter. That realization felt definitive, because once upon a time I would have believed that closure lived inside his words, that the right explanation, the right apology, the right acknowledgement could tie everything up neatly. Now I knew better. Closure lived in the absence of his voice, in the quiet that stayed quiet, in the space where I could finally hear myself think. Blocking him hadn't erased the past. It had put it in its proper place. And slowly, without drama or announcement, my life began to feel like mine again. As time went on, the story stopped feeling unfinished. Not because everything suddenly made sense, but because I no longer needed it to. I realized that part of what had kept me tethered to him was the belief that relationships end with answers. That there's a final exchange where both people walk away equally informed and emotionally aligned. But that belief assumes both people are capable of meeting in the same place at the same time. We never were. I started remembering moments from the relationship that I had once dismissed as insignificant. Times when I'd waited for him to follow through. Times when I'd accepted vague reassurances instead of real commitment. Times when I'd felt uneasy but talked myself out of it because nothing was technically wrong. Blocking him reframed those memories, not as failures on my part, but as signals I'd ignored because I wanted the relationship to work more than I wanted to listen to myself. That was a difficult truth to sit with. I wasn't angry at him anymore, but I was honest about what he had given and what he hadn't. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He simply never offered the consistency I needed, and I kept trying to translate that into something more generous than it was. What blocking him gave me wasn't closure in the traditional sense. It gave me finality. Finality is uncomfortable because it removes the possibility of revision. No more maybe if. No more what if he realizes. No more imagined futures where things turn out differently. Blocking him closed off those paths completely. And strangely, that felt freeing. I noticed how much emotional labor I'd been doing after the breakup without realizing it. Holding space for his feelings. Leaving the door open so he wouldn't feel rejected. Managing the ending so it wouldn't feel too harsh. All of that effort had been one-sided, just like so much of the relationship itself. Blocking him was the first ending I didn't manage for someone else. I also began to understand that explanations can sometimes function as self-betrayal. When you explain yourself to someone who has consistently misunderstood or minimized you, you're not clarifying, you're just reopening yourself to dismissal. I didn't need him to agree with my boundary for it to be valid. I didn't need him to understand my silence for it to be necessary. And I didn't need to soften the impact of my decision just to preserve his comfort. That realization changed how I viewed conflict entirely. Not every boundary needs to be discussed. Not every ending needs to be negotiated. Some decisions exist solely to protect what remains of you. I thought often about how blocking is framed culturally as extreme, as something people do when they're angry or impulsive. But anger had nothing to do with it. By the time I blocked him, I was tired, not furious. Clear, not reactive. Blocking him wasn't a loss of control. It was the moment I regained it. I don't tell this story to justify myself anymore. I tell it because it taught me something I hadn't known before. That peace doesn't always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from refusal. Refusal to stay accessible. Refusal to keep explaining. Refusal to carry unfinished conversations that lead nowhere. nowhere. And even now, when I think back to that morning, to the unopened message sitting quietly on my phone before I made my choice, I don't feel regret. I feel recognition. That was the moment I finally stopped waiting for him to let me go and let myself do it instead. That is where the story ends. Not with an apology sent or an explanation offered, but with a boundary that held. I didn't need a final conversation to validate my choice. I didn't need him to understand why I disappeared in order for my decision to be right for me. Blocking him wasn't about erasing the past. It was about protecting the future. I learned that closure doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from deciding you've asked enough questions. Sometimes it comes from choosing yourself without waiting for permission or understanding. If I'm the villain in his version of events, I can live with that. I'm no longer interested in being seen as reasonable at the expense of my own peace. I didn't leave out of anger. I didn't disappear to punish him. I walked away because staying reachable was costing me more than it was worth, and that decision, quiet as it was, gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: peace. That's the ending I chose.